Doran Vale had survived 3 planetary surveys, 2 crash landings, a fungal infection on Sector 9 that the medical logs still described as undocumented and frankly bewildering, and 4 years aboard the ISV Resurgent without a single complaint from his commanding officer. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who caused problems. He was also not a man who skipped breakfast. The galley on the Resurgent was a long, narrow room tucked between the cargo processing deck and the secondary engine corridor. It smelled, at any given time, like whatever the last 3 species had cooked in it. The Solvari crew preferred something that smelled faintly of warm minerals. The Drenathi, who made up a small portion of the science division, favored thin broths that left no odor at all. And then there were the humans, who had arrived 11 years ago into the interstellar collective and had been quietly upending assumptions ever since. Doran set his tray down at the far end of the long prep counter and got to work. He had a small personal storage unit in the galley, the kind every crew member was allocated, and his was a source of quiet fascination among the Solvari staff who had occasionally opened it by accident and then closed it again very quickly. From it he pulled a sealed packet of dark roasted coffee grounds, a strip of cured pork that had been pressed and dried and salted until it was almost more salt than meat, a small container of apple cider vinegar, a bag of mixed nuts, and 2 bird's-eye chili peppers that he had been growing in a biodome pot in his quarters, because the ship's food systems did not carry them, and he had not been willing to go without. He ground the coffee by hand. He liked the noise of it. Then he ran it through a small press he kept on his personal shelf and waited while the water cycled through. While it brewed, he sliced the cured pork thin, soaked the nuts in a splash of the vinegar, and set the chilies to the side to eat whole, which was how he had always eaten them and which he had never once considered unusual. The coffee finished. He poured it into a wide ceramic mug that said nothing on it because Doran was not a man who wanted words on his mugs. He arranged everything on his tray. He sat down. He was 2 sips into the coffee, and halfway through the first chili when Dr. Vresa walked in. Vresa was the senior xenobiologist attached to the Resurgent Solvari contingent. She was tall in the way Solvari were tall, which meant her proportions were slightly longer in the limb than a human's eye found comfortable, and she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had spent 40 years cataloging organisms that could kill her if she was careless. She wore her bioscan bracelet on her left wrist at all times. It was a habit so ingrained that she reportedly wore it to sleep. She crossed the galley toward the beverage console on the far wall. She was not looking at Doran. Then her bracelet made a sound. It was a soft sound, a single chime, the kind that indicated a biological compound of interest had been detected nearby. She paused. The bracelet chimed again. Then it began a low, continuous tone that Vresa associated with readings that required immediate documentation. She turned around slowly. Doran was eating his chili. He had just picked up the second one. Vresa walked toward him with the careful steps of someone approaching something she was not entirely sure about. She raised her wrist and looked at the readout. Then she looked at his tray, then at the readout again. The screen was flagging compounds in rapid succession: methylxanthine derivative, category 3 cardiac disruptor by Solvari classification; capsaicinoid compounds, nerve irritant class 2, sufficient concentration to induce systemic shock in a Drenathi or a Velisi; nitrite compounds in the cured protein strip; acetic acid, classified as a corrosive digestive hazard in 4 of the 7 species aboard the ship. "Excuse me," she said. Doran looked up. He had a perfectly pleasant expression. "Morning." "What is that?" she said. It was not entirely a question. It was more the kind of thing a person says when they are looking at something their brain has not yet filed correctly. "Breakfast," he said. She pointed at the coffee. "That liquid, what is it?" "Coffee." She checked the scan. Methylxanthine derivative. Her bracelet's threat assessment suggested immediate quarantine of the substance. That compound is a cardiac disruptor. For my species, a concentration half that strength would cause arrhythmia within 4 minutes. Good thing you're not drinking it, Doran said and took a sip. Vressa reached across the table and picked up the tray. She did it the way you might pick up something you found on the floor that you were not sure had stopped moving. Doran watched his breakfast leave his hands with the expression of a man who was very tired and had not yet had enough coffee to be patient about anything. I am confiscating these substances for analysis, Vressa said. You will need to report to the medical bay for observation, immediately. Doran looked at her. He looked at his tray, now in her hands. He looked at the chili pepper she had also taken, which he had been looking forward to. He looked back at her. Doctor, he said, slowly and clearly, in the way a person speaks when they want to make sure there is absolutely no possibility of a translation error. That is my daily breakfast. Vressa stared at him. Her bracelet was still alarming softly in the background. She turned to look at it again, as if hoping it had corrected itself. It had not. The readings were unchanged. That, she said, is not possible. From the corridor doorway, where he had been leaning against the frame with a cup of his own, Brix watched the whole exchange and started laughing so hard he had to put a hand on the wall to stay upright. Doran was escorted to the medical bay 10 minutes later, coffeeless, breakfastless, and wearing the expression of a man who had been through worse and would survive this too, though he was less certain about his mood for the rest of the day. His chili peppers were logged as hazardous samples. They were given their own storage container. The container was labeled in 3 languages. This would later turn out to be unnecessary, but no one aboard knew that yet. The medical bay of the ISV Resurgent had been designed to handle 6 species. It had scanners calibrated for Solvari physiology, Drenathi chemical profiles, Velisi atmospheric sensitivity, and 3 others. It had never, until 11 years ago when humanity joined the collective, been asked to process a human being. The adjustments made since then were technically adequate, but Dr. Vressa had always privately felt that the human medical profile in their system read less like a biological record and more like a challenge. Doran sat on the examination platform with his arms resting on his knees and the look of a man who had made peace with being somewhere he did not want to be. He had asked, twice, whether someone could bring him coffee from the galley. He had been told no both times by Nurse Tale, who had said it with genuine apology and an expression that suggested she personally found the situation as strange as he did. Vressa ran the first scan. She watched the results come in on the display panel and said nothing for a while. The scan was looking for damage, tissue disruption, organ stress, chemical accumulation in blood or lymph, any signal that a biological system was fighting off something hostile. She had seen the compounds on his tray. She knew what they were capable of. She was braced for findings that would explain why he appeared functional despite having ingested them. The scan found nothing wrong. She recalibrated and ran it again. Still nothing. His cardiac rhythm was steady and within range for his species. His neural activity was unremarkable. His digestive markers showed active processing, nothing elevated to distress levels. She leaned toward the panel and looked more carefully. Then she saw it. Not damage, function. The caffeine was not accumulating in his system the way it would in a Solvari. It was being metabolized, and the metabolites were feeding directly into his neural arousal cycle. His brain was using it efficiently. The capsaicin from the chili had triggered a release of endorphins, which were currently providing a mild and sustained elevation in his mood and pain threshold. The acetic acid from the vinegar had adjusted his gastric enzyme activity to improve protein breakdown. The nitrites from the cured meat were being processed through a pathway Vressa had to look up, because she had never seen it function in a living subject outside of theoretical models. His body had not tolerated these compounds. It had eaten them alive and asked for more. Tail, who had been quietly running a parallel database search at the secondary console, made a small sound. Vressa looked over. Tail had pulled up the standard human dietary records from the collective's biological registry. She had been reading for about 4 minutes. She looked the way she looked when she found a field sample she did not have a category for. "Doctor," Tail said carefully, "I think this may be normal for them." Vressa crossed to her console and read over her shoulder. The registry listed human consumables of note. It was a long list. Ethanol, a cellular solvent that humans consumed recreationally in concentrations that would disqualify the substance from being near Solvari food prep areas. Refined sucrose in quantities that Solvari nutritional science classified as incompatible with long-term organ function. Tannins, oxalic acid. Solanine, a compound found in several human food plants that the registry noted had previously been classified as a toxin before researchers realized humans ate the plant anyway and simply did not record any ill effects. Lectins, caffeine in multiple delivery formats across dozens of daily preparations. Capsaicinoids in a range spanning mild to, as one registry note put it, physiologically inadvisable concentrations that humans have developed competitive events around consuming. Tail scrolled further. There was a section on fermented foods. She read it. She scrolled back up and read a part of it again. "They intentionally cultivate bacteria," she said, "in the food before eating it." "I am aware," Vressa said. "Some of those bacteria produce acid while it is being digested." "I am aware of that as well." Doran from the examination platform said, "Are you going to tell me what you found, or do I just sit here?" "You are within normal parameters," Vressa said, still reading. "I know. That is the part I am working through." She pulled up his complete metabolic profile and stood looking at it for a long moment. There was nothing broken. There was nothing compensating for damage. The human in front of her had eaten what her bracelet classified as 4 separate biohazardous materials for breakfast, and his body had processed all 4 of them with the efficiency of a system that had been doing this every single day for decades, because it had been. She opened a new report file on her console and began writing. She flagged it priority. She addressed it to Admiral Sarath, who commanded the Solvari complement of the crew, because she felt strongly that someone above her rank should be made aware that the human biological file in their system was significantly understating the situation. Doran watched her type. Then he said, "Could I at least have some tea while I wait?" Tail was already moving toward the storage unit. She came back with a sealed pouch of what she considered a safe, neutral herbal preparation and handed it to him. He turned it over, read the label, and raised one eyebrow. "This has valerian in it," he said. "It is a calming formula," Tail said. "Humans use valerian as a sleep aid." Tail looked at the pouch, then at Doran, then back at the pouch. She took it back and held it like she was reconsidering everything she knew about what the word calming meant. "Do you have anything without herbs?" he asked. She found him plain hot water. He accepted it without complaint. He sat quietly on the platform and drank it while Vressa finished her report, and he did not say anything else, which was its own kind of patience that Tail quietly noted in her personal log under the heading, Human Behavioral Observations, Day 1. There was a particular kind of silence that fell in Admiral Sarath's office when he was reading something that was changing his understanding of the world. His staff had learned to recognize it. It was not a comfortable silence. It had weight to it. It was the silence of a man who was very carefully deciding which parts of what he was reading were going to require action, and which parts were simply going to require him to sit with them for a while. He had been sitting with Vressa's report for 11 minutes. His aide, a young officer named Pellin who had been stationed outside the office long enough to know the silences well, knocked and opened the door a small amount and asked if the Admiral required anything. Sarath looked up and told him to find Commander Yessa, Chief Medical Liaison Brandt, and if she was available, Captain Marin of the human contingent. He wanted them in the briefing room in 20 minutes. Pellin went to find them. Sarath looked back at the report. Then he did something he very rarely did, which was open the background file that had been attached to every human crew member when they joined the Resurgent at the start of the mission. He had read a summary. He remembered reading a summary. He had noted at the time that humans were within acceptable biological parameters for mixed crew deployment and had moved on to what he had considered more pressing matters. He read the full file now. 20 minutes later, he was standing at the head of the briefing table with 5 officers seated around it, and Captain Marin of the Resurgent's human crew sitting at the far end, with the relaxed posture of someone who had agreed to attend a meeting, without being entirely told what the meeting was about. Sarath read from the file. He did not summarize. He read directly, which was not something he usually did in briefings, but he felt the information lost something if it was paraphrased. He read the section on human skeletal structure first, the living mineral lattice reinforcement of human bone, the fact that human bones, over time, became denser in response to regular physical load, as if the body were monitoring itself and upgrading the parts that were being used the most. Commander Yessa wrote something on her tablet. Sarath kept reading. He read the section on human sleep, 4 to 6 hours per cycle at operational standard. He noted that the Solvari minimum was 9. He looked up briefly to see if anyone at the table was having the same reaction he was. Yessa was still writing. Brandt was looking at the table. Marin was watching Sarath with an expression that was not quite amusement but was in that neighborhood. He read the healing rate section. Then, because the table had gone very quiet, he also read the subsection titled Inflammatory Response, which used the phrase, a localized vascular and cellular defense mechanism that human medicine has historically viewed as uncomfortable but productive, and which concluded that the outcome of this mechanism was, functionally, that human tissue repaired itself faster after damage than almost any comparable species in the collective registry. He stopped reading and set the tablet down. "Are there questions?" he said. "Several," said Yessa. "I will address them. Before I do, I want to note that Dr. Vressa's report this morning was not an isolated incident. Her report was a symptom. The incident was the fact that none of us read this file in full before departure." He said it without sharpness, which was somehow more effective than if he had been angry about it. "I want that noted." Marin said mildly, "Is there a concern about crew safety?" "Yes," Sarath said. "My crew's safety." He paused. "I meant the Solvari crew, given what I have just read." Marin looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Admiral, my crew is not a hazard to yours." "No," he said. "I understand that. I am referring to the general state of my own assumptions and whether they are safe to operate with going forward." He picked the tablet up again. "There is a section here on human dietary intake. I have read Vressa's report. I wanted to read the source file also. It lists ethanol as a routine recreational substance." "Yes." "Consumed voluntarily." "Yes." "In concentrations that would require medical intervention if a Solvari were accidentally exposed." "That's correct." Sarath looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked back at her. "Captain," he said, "I want you to understand that I am not criticizing. I am updating." Meanwhile, on the deck below, Doran had returned from the medical bay and found his personal galley storage unit undisturbed. Everything in it was exactly as he had left it. This was because no one else had the code, and also because the other crew members who occasionally passed by it tended to move away from it when their own sensors chirped at them. He took out his spare coffee pack, the backup he always kept because he had long ago learned to plan for confiscation, equipment failure, and general galactic misunderstanding, and set the press going again. Bricks came in halfway through, and dropped into a chair with the easy familiarity of someone who owned the room without actually owning it. He had his own mug already. He had sourced coffee from his quarters stash, which was separate from Doran's stash, because both of them had learned independently that redundancy was a survival skill. They sat in comfortable quiet while the coffee finished. Medical bay was interesting, Brix asked. Vressa filed a priority report to the Admiral, Doran said. Brix considered this. About your breakfast. About me, I think. The breakfast was the entry point. You going to be okay? I'm fine. They checked everything twice. Doran poured his coffee. She looked like she wanted to check it a third time, but I think she ran out of things to be alarmed about. Brix smiled into his mug. Down the corridor in the briefing room, Sarath was asking Marin if humans regularly slept only 5 hours, and she was saying yes, often less during survey operations, and the silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. In her personal log, Tail wrote, Day 1, continued, beginning to think the orientation material for this mission was severely incomplete. She was not wrong. 2 days after the incident in the galley, Vressa sent Doran a formal request for an interview. She had written it carefully. The language was precise and polite, and said in a great many words that she was a scientist who had encountered data that fell outside her current model, and was requesting a structured conversation as the most reasonable path to updating that model. She had spent an hour on it. She had rewritten the opening 3 times. Doran read it in about 40 seconds and sent back, Sure, let me finish eating first. They met in the forward observation lounge at the end of the second shift cycle. It was a narrow room with a long curved window that looked out onto open space, currently showing the edge glow of the HFY nebula in the distance, a wash of deep copper and blue light that sat still and enormous outside the glass. The lounge was rarely used at this hour. Vressa had chosen it specifically because it was quiet, and she could set her scanner somewhere discreet and still have it running. Doran arrived with a bowl. It contained something Vressa's scanner immediately began cataloging with what she recognized, after 2 days of recalibrating her reaction, as professional interest rather than alarm. Spiced grain cooked in a broth he had apparently made himself, with what appeared to be dried pepper flakes on top. She let it go. She had a notebook open and a list of questions prepared. Tail sat to one side with her own notes. She had technically attended as Vressa's assistant. She was not taking the same kinds of notes as Vressa. The interview began formally. Name, role, years of service, home region on Earth. Doran answered each question plainly while eating his bowl. Then Vressa moved to the dietary section, and Tail's pen started moving faster. Vressa asked him to describe, as precisely as he could, what a typical week of food looked like. Not for him specifically, for humans in general. What was routine? What was standard? Doran put his spoon down and thought about it. He said it depended on the region, the culture, the personal preference, and the availability, but that there were some things that crossed most of those lines. He mentioned coffee again. He mentioned alcohol, which he explained was ethanol in diluted form, consumed in social and recreational contexts, and that the concentrations varied from very low to extremely high depending on the person and the occasion, and that some humans treated the high end of that range as an informal point of pride. Vressa wrote, voluntary neurotoxic consumption as a social bonding ritual. He talked about sugar, refined, concentrated, eaten in quantities that he said his own species' medical community had been arguing about for over a century without reaching a final verdict, but that had not slowed anyone down. He mentioned bread made with fermented yeast cultures. He mentioned cheeses aged with live mold. He mentioned cured meats, smoked meats, meats cooked at high temperatures specifically to produce chemical browning reactions on the surface that his species had a word for, and that tasted, as he put it, extremely good. Tail wrote browning reaction. Look up Maillard reaction human cooking, Deliberate chemical transformation of food before ingestion, not a preservation method, a flavor method. Vressa asked him about the chilies. She wanted to understand that specifically. She asked why, not medically. Why? Doran looked at the window for a moment. The copper light of the nebula sat in the glass like something slow and permanent. He said the spice caused a physical response, a sensation of heat and pain that the body then pushed back against with its own chemistry. The pushback felt good. Some people chased that feeling. Some people started mild and moved up over years until they were eating things that would have been meaningless to their earlier selves. He said it was a kind of personal progress, a record of the ground your own body had learned to hold. Vressa stopped writing and looked at him. He said food in general was like that for humans, not just the spicy things. It was cultural memory and social glue and personal identity, and sometimes a form of competition, and sometimes a form of love. You fed people you cared about. You learned the food of the place you came from and you carried it with you. You tried the food of somewhere new as a way of trying to understand that place. The flavors were a language that did not need translation because the experience of eating was the translation. Tale had stopped writing entirely. She was just listening. Vressa looked at her notes. Then she looked at Doran's bowl, the plain, battered ceramic bowl he had brought from his quarters and that she strongly suspected he had owned for a very long time. Then she looked at him. She asked, with the careful tone of someone asking a question they were not sure they wanted fully answered, whether he would be willing to explain the concept of acquired taste. He explained it. He described the process of eating something unfamiliar or unpleasant or sharp and coming back to it again and again until the thing that was once difficult became ordinary and then became liked and then sometimes became necessary. He said humans did this deliberately. He said some people collected it, the expansion of what they could enjoy, the way other people collected objects or experiences. Vressa wrote, voluntary repeated exposure to aversion stimuli until the aversion is replaced by preference. No medical basis for this as a therapy. Humans do it recreationally. She underlined the last word twice. Then Doran reached into the side pocket of his jacket and put a single small chili pepper on the table between them. He did not say anything. He just left it there. Vressa looked at it for a long time. Tale looked at it, then at Doran, then back at it. She reached out and picked it up slowly with both hands, holding it the way someone holds a thing that is either valuable or volatile and they are not yet sure which. It will not hurt you, Doran said. Not permanently, and it stops. Tale held the pepper and looked at it with the face of someone making a decision. Then she set it down carefully in front of her, not handing it back, keeping it close. Vressa looked at this and said nothing. She closed her notebook. The interview was over. She sent a second report to Sarath that evening. It was longer than the first. The last line read, I believe we have significantly underestimated the complexity of human culture. I am updating my research framework and recommend the crew orientation materials be revised accordingly. She considered adding more. She decided that was enough for now. Sarath read it, set it down, and looked at his ceiling for a while. Brix had been planning the dinner for 4 days. This was not unusual for Brix, who approached most things in his life with the energy of someone who had decided to be excellent at them, and had not left room in his schedule for being mediocre. He was a mechanic by training and by instinct, which meant he thought about most problems the way he thought about a broken drive coupling. Identify what it needs, gather the right materials, and do not stop until the thing works the way it is supposed to. He had decided the dinner needed to work. He had submitted the request to Captain Marin as a formal cultural exchange activity, which she had approved with a straight face and a note in the log that said authorized, interspecies cultural engagement, crew relations initiative. He had cleared the time on the galley roster. He had made a list. Doran had looked at the list and said it was going to be a lot. Brix had said that was the point. The smell reached the corridor outside the galley, about 40 minutes before the food was ready. 3 Solvari crew members who had been heading toward the secondary lab turned around and went a different way. This was not a judgment. It was a reasonable response. The smells coming from the galley were not bad in any absolute sense. They were simply very present and very complex, and operated at an intensity that Solvari olfactory systems found difficult to categorize quickly. There was smoke. From the meat Brix was slow finishing in the small portable smoker he had packed in his personal cargo at the start of the mission, as if he had foreseen this exact moment. There was the rich, deep smell of the chili pot that had been simmering for 2 hours. There was the dense yeast-encrusted smell of the black bread Doran had baked that morning in the oven. The galley technically had, but that had not previously been used for bread by anyone aboard. There was the sharp background note of the aged cheese he had set out to come to room temperature, which Tail had walked past 3 times now, slowing down each time. Admiral Sarath arrived because he had decided that not arriving would be diplomatically incoherent. He had said this to Pellin privately. Pellin had agreed without laughing, which Sarath appreciated. Vressa arrived because the dinner was, she had written in her log, a unique opportunity for observational research in a naturalistic setting. She had also arrived because Tail had looked at her with the specific expression that meant please come, so she had come. 4 other Solvari came. Brix had invited the whole ship. 4 out of 23 was, Doran privately noted, a better ratio than he had expected. The humans arranged the food on the long galley table. The chili went in the center, dark and thick, smelling of cumin and dried pepper and something slow-cooked and patient. The bread was sliced and set out on a board. The cheese sat in wedges next to it, the rind dry and a little rough-looking, the interior almost amber. The smoked meat was carved and stacked. There was a pot of strong black coffee that Brix had made in the large press and set at one end with mugs. And there was also, because Doran had quietly made it as an alternative, a pot of mild warm grain broth that the Solvari would be able to tolerate without their sensors alarming. On a small plate at the center of the table, surrounded by nothing, sat a pile of raw bird's-eye chilies. Vressa looked at the chilies. "Are those decorative?" she said. "Purely," said Brix. His expression suggested the word had more than one meaning. The dinner started. The Solvari were given small amounts, adapted portions, chosen carefully by Doran, who had thought about this. Tail tried the bread first. She held a piece, smelled it, and put a small amount in her mouth. She chewed. She paused. She took a slightly larger piece. Vressa wrote in her notebook, "Tail, bread, positive response. Second portion taken voluntarily. No distress." Sarath, sitting near Marin at the end of the table, was handed a mug of coffee by Brix, who had not asked how he wanted it and had given him the straight black version because it was simpler. Sarath looked at it. He smelled it. He looked at Marin, who had her own mug and was drinking from it without visible concern. He took a sip. His expression went through 3 stages very quickly. The first was surprise. The second was something difficult to name that involved his eyes going very slightly wider. The third was a careful attempt to reassemble his face into a neutral expression, which mostly worked. Doran, sitting across the table, laughed. It came out of him without his permission, a short, honest laugh, and then he pressed his mouth closed and looked at his bowl. Marin looked at Sarath. Sarath looked at his mug. "Bitter," he said. "Yes," Marin said. "Is it supposed to be?" "Most people add something to it. Sugar, milk, various things. Doran drinks it like that." Sarath looked at Doran with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite alarm, and sat somewhere between them in a way that Doran was fairly used to receiving from Solvari by now. Marin got him a small amount of sugar, and he tried it again. This version he found acceptable, which he said with the tone of a man who was grading something on a very different scale than usual. Vressa tried the pickled vegetables, 1 piece. She held it with the careful deliberateness of someone performing an experiment they had designed themselves. She put it in her mouth. She sat with it for a moment. She swallowed. She checked her bracelet. The bracelet noted the acetic acid, the salt concentration, and the fermentation byproducts and flagged them. She looked at the flag. She silenced it. She wrote in her notebook, "Consumed, no acute reaction. Flavor profile, sharp, complex, unfamiliar, not unpleasant." She did not take another piece, but she did not move her chair back from the table either. Tail, who had been working up to it for the last 10 minutes, picked up a chili from the decorative plate. Everyone at the table who had noticed did not say anything, because saying something felt like it would ruin it. Tail looked at the chili. She had read about it. She had listened to Doran explain it. She was a scientist, and she had decided she was going to approach this like a scientist, which meant she was going to collect the data directly rather than read about it from a safe distance. She bit the end off, a small bite, just the tip. For about 2 seconds she looked normal. Then the capsaicin arrived and her eyes went wide, and she put the chili down on her plate and sat very still. "It will stop," Doran said. She nodded, not speaking, eyes slightly bright, processing. "Keep going," Brick said gently. "Your mouth is just surprised." She sat with it. The burn moved through and under and around, and then, slowly, it did what Doran had said it would do. It began to settle, and under it, at the edge of where it had been, was something that she did not have a word for in her language, but that she thought, if she had to describe it, was a little like what the air felt like after a long stillness finally broke. She wrote in her log later, after dinner, when everyone had gone and she was sitting in the empty lounge with the copper light of the nebula outside the window, "Tried chili. It hurt. Then it didn't. I want to understand that space between the hurt and the not hurting. I think that might be the whole point." Bricks cleaned the galley alone that night, which he always did, because he liked how quiet it was after a meal that had gone right. 3 weeks passed the way weeks pass on long missions, with the slow rhythm of shifts and scans and system checks, and the occasional moment of strange beauty when the HFY nebula shifted light in a way the charts had not predicted, and someone stopped in the corridor to look at it through the nearest window, whoever they were and whatever species. The ISV Resurgent moved through deep space, and its crew moved through their routines, and the routines, quietly, had changed a little. Doran ate breakfast in the galley every morning. No one confiscated anything. Vressa occasionally walked through on her way to the lab, and her bioscan bracelet still chimed once or twice at the coffee, and she had taken to acknowledging the chime with the small nod of a person who has made a kind of peace with information that will never stop being technically true. She did not stop. She did not comment. He did not say anything either. It was, in its own way, a form of respect. Tail had been keeping a log. It had grown considerably. It had started as a supplementary note file attached to Vressa's official xenobiological record, which was the standard format for junior researcher observations. But somewhere around day 8 it had developed its own structure, its own headings, its own voice, and it was now something that Tail thought of privately as her real work on this mission, the thing she would be thinking about long after the Resurgent docked and the crew dispersed. She had tried more things, not because anyone pushed her, because she was curious, and because she had decided that being curious and then stopping at the edge was not what scientists were supposed to do. She had tried the bread with aged cheese, which she found strange, and then, after 2 more attempts spread across a week, good. She had tried the grain broth with smoked meat, a smaller human dish Doran made on days when he was not eating his full breakfast, and she had liked it more than she expected, and noted that in her log with an asterisk because it surprised her. She had tried a second chili, slightly larger than the first, and had sat with it more calmly, and had noted afterward that the place between the pain and the not pain was exactly where she remembered it, and that she was beginning to understand why someone might want to go back there. She had not told Vressa about all of this. Vressa knew some of it. Tail suspected Vressa knew more than she had mentioned, because Vressa was observant in the way that experienced scientists are observant, which is constantly and without announcing it. What Vressa had done was update her research framework. She had done this quietly, without ceremony, the way serious people make serious corrections. The human file that attached to Vressa's name in the collective biology archive had been growing for 3 weeks. She had not flagged it for internal review yet. She was still in the middle of it. She kept finding that the next section required more thought than she had originally allocated, and that the thought kept arriving in directions she had not planned for. She had written 4 pages on the concept of spice tolerance alone, and she was not finished. At the command level, Sarath had received a message from the Collective Science Authority. They had seen Vressa's 2 reports, both of them, and they had questions. The authority's message was politely worded and carefully structured in the way that official messages from scientific bodies are when they are actually expressing something between confusion and alarm. They asked if the human biological anomalies described were confirmed by direct observation. They asked if there were safety implications for mixed-crew vessels. They asked, specifically, about the dietary section, whether the human subjects were intentionally consuming the listed compounds, or whether the records reflected accidental exposure. Sarath read the message twice. He thought about the dinner. He thought about Doran eating a chili pepper with the easy comfort of a man eating something he had eaten 1,000 times. He thought about Brix handing him a mug of black coffee without asking, and then smiling when he tasted it, not unkindly, just the smile of someone who knows how that moment goes and does not mind it. He thought about Marin sitting at the end of the table explaining the history of coffee to him in the patient, warm way. She explained most things about her species, as if she was quietly fond of all of it and wanted to share that, not to impress him, just to share. He wrote back to the authority. He kept it short, because he had found that short answers to questions like this one sat better than long ones. He confirmed that the observations were direct. He confirmed there were no safety concerns for mixed-crew operations. He wrote that the human dietary data was accurate and reflected standard practice, not exposure or accident. Then he paused over the last part of his reply for a while, because he wanted to get it right. He wrote, "The human crew presents no hazard to the mission or to the Solvari complement. I would suggest that the current biological classification system, which was built to describe the species we already understood, may require revision to account for a species that the system was not designed around. The humans are not anomalous. The framework is." He sent it and went a fine tea, the plain kind, without anything Tail might accidentally find interesting. In the galley, Doran was eating breakfast. Coffee, cured meat, vinegar-soaked nuts, 1 chili. The same as always. Vressa's notebook was open on the table across from him. She was not eating. She was watching and writing, which was her version of being present, and it had become, without either of them deciding it, a kind of routine. She asked him something she had been working up to for 3 days. She asked whether humans ever got used to things so completely that they forgot the things had once been hard. Doran looked at his coffee mug. He thought about it the way he thought about things he actually wanted to answer well. He said yes. He said that was mostly how it went. The hard thing became the normal thing and then became the necessary thing, and eventually you could not remember the version of yourself that had not known it. He said sometimes you found it again by watching someone else try it for the first time. He glanced toward the door. Tail had just appeared in the corridor, walking toward the galley, looking at the small chili pepper in her hand with the expression of someone having a private conversation with a decision they had already made. Doran said nothing. He picked up his coffee. Vressa kept writing. Brix arrived last, the way he always did, dropped into a chair and raised his mug without looking at anyone in particular. A toast to nothing specific. To the morning. To the distance still ahead of them. To whatever strange and ordinary and extraordinary thing was about to happen next. The ship moved on through the copper light, and somewhere behind them the galaxy continued without comment, as it always had, as it always would, entirely unaware of how much it still had left to learn.